Lesson 3.2, Complex Numbers. How do you define and use the imaginary unit I? Let's go ahead and take a look at simplifying powers of I. So of I to the first power. Well, I know that I was the same thing as the square root of negative 1. So we have the square root of negative 1 to the first power. So what is the square root of negative 1 to the first power? Well, this is just I to the first power, which is the same as I. So I to the first power simplifies down to I. Let's look at what that means with I to the second power. So I is the square root of negative 1, but I is raised to the second power. How does this simplify? Well, I know the square root and the exponent of a 2 cancel each other out. So that meant that I to the second power simplifies down to negative 1. What does that mean about I to the third? Well, I know that I to the third is the same thing as I to the second power times I to the first power. I to the second power, you just said, was negative 1. So this is the same thing as negative 1 times, you said I to the first power was I. Negative 1 times I is a negative I. So I to the third power simplifies down to negative I. Well, what about I to the fourth? I know I to the fourth is the same thing as I squared times I squared. Well, I squared is negative 1. This I squared is also negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is a positive 1. So I to the fourth simplifies down to positive 1. Well, what about I to the fifth? I know I can get I to the fifth by taking I to the fourth and combining it with I to the first, because 4 plus 1 is 5. Well, what is I to the fourth? You told me I to the fourth was 1. What is I to the first? You told me I to the first was I. So what is 1 times I? 1 times I is I. Well, what about I to the sixth? I can know that I can make a 6 by taking I to the fourth times I to the second, because 4 plus 2 is 6. I know I to the fourth. You told me I to the fourth was 1. I know I to the second. You told me I to the second was a negative 1. 1 times negative 1 is a negative 1. So I to the sixth simplified down to negative 1. What about I to the seventh? I know I can get 7 by taking 4 and adding it to 3. Rules of exponents say 4 plus 3 is 7. Well, what is I to the fourth? You said I to the fourth was 1. What is I to the third? You said I to the third was a negative I. What's 1 times a negative I? That is negative I. Last one, I to the eighth. I know I can rewrite I to the eighth as I to the fourth times I to the fourth, because 4 plus 4 is 8. What is I to the fourth? That's 1. What is the other I to the fourth? That's 1. What's 1 times 1? That is 1. Using what we just learned, I see I to the 1 was I to the fifth was also I. 2nd and 6 were negative 1. 3 and 7s were negative I's. 4 and 8 are 1s. From this pattern, I deduce that every set of 4 is going to be a repeat of positive I, negative 1, negative I, positive 1. How can I connect that to I to the 15? I know that if I can rewrite it as I to the fourths or as I to the eighths, those are the same thing as 1s. So 15. How many groups of 4 exist in 15? I can do I to the fourth times I to the fourth, that's 8, times another I to the fourth, that's 12. I cannot do another I to the fourth, so 12 with 3 more would have given me 15. There's another way that you could have written this. How many times did I see I to the fourth? I see that I to the fourth was 3 times. 3 times 4 was 12. And then I see that I had an I to the third. I to the fourth is 1. So that's 1 to the third times what is I to the third? That is a negative I. What is 1 to the third? That is 1 times, we already simplified negative I. So what is 1 times a negative I? This is negative I. You just simplified I to the 15th, and it is negative I. Let's go ahead and try I to the 62nd. How many groups of 4, because we noticed every round of 4, it's 1. So how many groups of 4 can I get to get really close to 62? Well, I know that 15 groups of 4 would give me 60. I need 2 more to get to the 62. So I to the 4th is 1. So I have 1 to the 15th. What is I to the 2nd power? You said he was a negative 1. 1 to the 15th power is 1 times a negative 1. 1 times a negative 1 is negative 1. So you just simplified I to the 62nd to be negative 1.